We'll now call on Sheldon's Skaggs, Karen Pierce, Mike Lawrence, and Terry Powes. I've never known Terry to have anything to do with basketball or basketball terminology, but his topic is full court press, ongoing investigation in courtyards of Pacbitun BAS.
All right, thank you. I'm very privileged to be here. It's a great honor to be able to present. Let me see if I can work this.
I think it's the other way around.
Other way around.
Wait, no, sorry. Ramos help us.
There we go. Okay, so the site of Pacbitun is somewhere between the Maya Mountains and the Belize River Valley, so we're kind of on the cusp of these two resource and trade areas. We look like we're out of the way. You don't see any water access there, but part of my talk will be about the fact that we actually do have many trade goods that are coming back in. And I'm very glad we had the photogrammetry talks, both of them before me, because part of my other research is I'm doing photogrammetry on monos, because we have a big mono workshop at Pacbitun. And from that, since my students are already down taking photogrammetry models of monos, they also took some photogrammetry models of our other artifacts. And so we'll have some fruit of the photogrammetry that can come up during the coffee break and look at. So Pacbitun has 41 masonry structures, 5 plazas. It's a mid-level site of 5,000 to 10,000 people in the late Classic period. My research, unlike Terry's is the Middle Pre-Classic. I do the Late Classic, and we're looking at an area of the site that hasn't had much exposure before, which is the 3 courtyards that we have on the southern end of the site. And so there was a little bit of work done in '87 on this, one of the center buildings right here, and we have some LiDAR data so that you can see that this courtyard here is actually the lowest courtyard, but the buildings are taller on either side. Courtyard 2 is this middle one, and we've done the north building in that area. And then courtyard 1 here is actually the highest courtyard, with the smallest buildings on either side. And we really didn't know much of the chronology of how these were constructed. It was always kind of assumed that they all were put up at one time, just added on in the late Classic. And so we decided over the last couple of years to start excavating some of the plazas in the center of these courtyards to try and get some chronology, maybe start figuring out some of the access and maybe what they were using these for. And so here's the previous excavations. As I said, in '87, this big chunk was done on structure 23, and then my research has been to work on the eastern structure here of courtyard 1. We put in a bunch of units, and we've also put in center units. So this was last year's, which is where I'll focus my talk right here. We were going to put in center units on all 3 of these courtyards, but because of time constraints after what happened in courtyard 3, where I wound up spending the entire rest of the summer, which is the basis of this talk. So, first, I'll give you a little history of what we found in previous years. Some of it's been shown here in small detail. So working on structure 25, the eastern structure of courtyard 1. It's a typical range structure, lots of modifications that make the rooms smaller and smaller. And as I was going across the building to the north, we found right here a yellowish limestone, and when we looked on the back side here, we actually found out that it was carved. And so it is part of an altar. So this is what it looks like when reconstructed. You have this little headdress in the top of a head, and I'm told that's an owl. So that's kind of interesting. And it's actually, after we had it done, we realized that this is actually part of another piece of this altar that we had, which is actually buried in our largest structure in Plaza A. And so now we have Courtyard 1 also related to this big structure and a buried altar. However, if you look, this one is just kind of in a spine wall. It's at the very base of the spine wall. There is a large ceramic scatter in front of it, but it's from the late Classic. So it is a good 300 years after the altar was carved and then broken that this piece was either picked up, and that's the big debate, is did they intentionally pick it up and store it in this building as part of the architecture of the building, or was it just something that was laying around that got used as part of the wall? And I probably will never be able to figure that out, unfortunately. But that's from previous years. All right, and so while we were putting in our Courtyard 2 center unit right here, we found a piece of stone alignment, and it's actually wound up being, as we've discovered this year, part of a round structure that's about 12 to 13 meters in diameter, so it's quite large. It's from the Middle Preclassic, based on the ceramics from the inside and the outside, and so of course Dr. Powis really is very excited about that one, and he took over excavations there, so I didn't have to deal with it after that. And he'll report later on. But what I got last year, got bogged down in, pleasantly, was Courtyard 3, which, as you can see, I kept having to expand my unit. It's only supposed to be a 3x3 to figure out chronology. From chronology, it looks like the other courtyards have some use in the Middle Preclassic. They're either on the Middle Preclassic midden, or they have Middle Preclassic structures at the bottom of them. This one is actually only one plaster floor, maybe two plaster floors. It's all late Classic material. And we found 5 caches in this 3 meter by 3 meter area. And if you guys look, that's pretty linear stone arrangement. That's actually the first of the cyst burials that we found this year as well. So I'll go through the caches first, and then I'll show you the burials as well. And so these caches are actually stacks of different ceramic vessels, all kind of piled up on top of each other. We're able to get a little bit of carbon from them to get carbon dates. There aren't enough rim fragments to put them all back together, but there are enough to show that there were multiple different vessels that are all piled up. We also had this, which I'll talk about a little bit. This is our reconstructible vessel. It's actually one dish that has been broken into quarters and then stacked on top of each other. And it's right next to that cyst burial as well. All right, so from our first cache, we recovered 3 obsidian eccentrics, a jade pendant right here, which we'll talk a little bit more about, 3 chert eccentrics, spondylus bead, and a piece of spondylus shell. And so this was very intriguing. It's one of the larger pieces of jade that we found at Pacbitun. And I had my students take photogrammetry model photos of it so that I could take a look at that. And you can actually, when you're handling it, you can kind of see a little bit of a pattern, but you can't really see the grooves and things like that. You can feel them with your fingers, but once you put them in the model, you're actually able to look at them more, okay? And so, looking at this, we had the debate whether this hole was at the top or the bottom. There are 2 ways you can interpret this particular pendant. And so, if you imagine this is a foot, okay, with knees hanging like this is a bar that they're hanging off of, then the whole rest of the body goes straight down, and this is the head of the person. There's his nose, his mouth, his chin, and he's got this big headdress on top, or she, can't tell the difference. And that headdress has this little tassel that comes down off of it. Okay? The other way you can interpret this is that this is a stalk of corn, and this is a kernel of corn coming off with the silk tassel coming off the top of the corn. If you don't believe me, I do have printed out in biodegradable corn plastic the 3D thing. So please come, and you can handle it and look at it. Okay? That's why I'm glad I don't have to talk about all the photogrammetry. I talk about the interesting things. But here's what my interpretation is that this is a maze god or a diving god figure. These are from the later time period, a little bit after the late Classic, but you can see the legs up, the hands down, the head back, and the tassels of corn the top. And so, again, it's not my area of specialty necessarily, but I'm learning. We also have some ceramic vessels that have also diving god sort of imagery from it. So, moving on to some of the other caches, this is what we call cache 2, the second one we found. So, cache 1 is right here, cache 2 is here. It's actually, if you look at this, this is a spout. So, it looks like it's part of a musical instrument. This was all on top of that cis burial. We also had this part of a face. I'm not sure if maybe it was a drum. Pacbitun has a history of having musical instruments with burials, so it's not too far of a stretch to suggest that this may be a piece of 1 or 2 potential musical instruments. And here's our dish. It was, like I said, quartered, all stacked on top of each other. This is reconstructing part of one of those dishes. It's a Mountain Pine Ridge Old Gym variety, which will correspond very well to the radiocarbon dates I was able to get from the other 2 caches that are all cut into this same plaster floor. So the date is about, from the radiocarbon, around 550 to 650 AD, okay? And that's coming from cache 3, cache 3 and cache 5. Okay? Didn't get carbon from the other caches. Haven't had an opportunity or funding to do the radiocarbon dates on the burial material. We're just attempting to get it exported now for radiocarbon dating on burials. But I believe that, like I said, there's only one, maybe a poor plaster floor above this. I believe these caches do help us, in the ceramics, help us date this to 550 to 650 AD. And that's probably when the building was put up all at one time. So the first cis burial, here is the cis capstones outlined here before we started. It's one skeleton. Okay, so there's the map of it. Sorry, the picture's the reverse of the map. When I flip the picture over, for whatever reason, for me, it just doesn't look right if it wasn't the way we actually photographed it. The only grave good was this single miniature pot. These are tiny little pots, only about like that big. And unfortunately, tiny pots there really isn't a good chronology because they're kind of a one-shot manufacturing process, so there's a lot of variability. Maybe the paste configuration might help you date that, but again, when we are able to export the materials, we'll be able to get a radiocarbon date for this burial. It's very typical for us, which is head to the south, fully extended. Not much more to say at this point until the skeletal material is analyzed. About 1.7 meters tall, so maybe male. So, as I continued, we found this cache getting to the end of the unit. We started finding another cis burial-like features, so I had to extend. When I extended, I started coming across these very large slate slabs. So this is 1.5 meters long, so this is like about a half of a pool table. It weighs about 200 pounds. When we had to carry it out of courtyard 3, remember how low that is? It had to come up the side, which isn't a real big effort. But at Pacbitun, usually where we find slate is on top of burials. And in fact, our main burial in the structure 1 was a slate-capped tomb. And so that means I had to do a lot of extensions, and we had to take it all out in one piece. And so the rest of my summer was digging further and further to the west and finding more and more burials. And actually if anyone has seen a burial that looks like this, I'd love to know what it's called. I've looked through the literature and I can't figure it out. I'm going to call it a cairn capstone burial because it is a pile of rocks that are right on top of the burial. There weren't other rocks around. It's cut through the plaster floor, so it's intrusive to that plaster floor, and all the stones are burnt, and we found fragments of the grave goods throughout. So I'm not sure if this person was disturbed in antiquity and reburied, or exactly what's going on, but some of the grave goods that come from here were actually found a couple meters away in the closet units that are the extensions. But we know this is based on the grave goods, this was a very important individual. Okay? So the Sis burial, when I was finally able to uncover it, that's the other one to the west, it actually has two individuals. Both head south. So if you look at that profile, that's not what skeletons are supposed to look like. You've got a set of arms up here, and another set of arms here, and two sets of femurs. So it's two people that were laid on top of each other. The skull for the second person overlaps at about the waist of the first person. Unlike the first burial, this is the hands are like this on both of them. They're both face down, head to the south, which is pretty typical for us at Pacbitun. Two miniature pots. I'm not sure if that was one for each person. One of the miniature pots was right with the person. The other one looked like it had been moved or fallen during the burial process. So this is another view when we start talking about the burial that's underneath this cairn of stones. We've removed about half of them at this point. It's about 1.5 meters wide by 1 meter tall, just piled burnt stone with lots of charcoal in that. When we get that exported, I'll be able to hopefully tell whether this is when the disturbance or reburial happened. So in blue are the skeletal bones and the rocks surrounding that. This is where the skull was, so not exactly in line. The gold is the slate that you'll be seeing in the next, because this person was buried underneath the cairn, but on top of slate slabs, which is really interesting for us because we don't usually find people on top of slate slabs. We find them under slate slabs. So here is, as you pulled off the cairn, here's the skull. It was up against the side. You have the femurs here. And we found teeth in this area where the head probably should have been. And so I think the head was pulled out and then redeposited. See a little bit of green, that's jade. The white here is actually some of the other interesting material we found. This is conch shell. Through the literature, they call them lunates or adornment. We thought maybe it was like wrist pendants, but it's got a lot. As you can see, it's got all these holes for attachment. And so eventually I realized that this is not some sort of adornment. It's actually part of a atlatl. And so, again, if you've got the time and the students, you can actually get things printed out. You can send it off to people who do paleo reconstruction. And so that's the two finger loops which we found, which were actually side by side, which made us, but they were near the head. So this is probably lying under the head or on top near the head. And when you look at the carvings, which you can do at the break, they have a mat symbol, which is usually a symbol of power. So this could be, maybe he wasn't a hunter or warrior, but maybe this was just a symbol of power. But this is what the atlatl may look like. Obviously wood doesn't survive, but it's based off of models in the British Museum from the Aztecs.
Very cool.
And so finally, here's a profile of that cairn capstone burial, for lack of a better word. Again, I was finding all of these small pieces of marble that had carvings on them. We thought they were pottery when we first pulled them up, but they're actually stone, they're actually marble. And they're spread throughout the cairn, a little bit in some of the surface deposits, just above the plastered floor. And here are the slate slabs below. So this burial is really out of order and messed up, but these are base fragments here. The two finger loops were found here, the teeth and the jade were found there. We did find a bone tube. Don't know if it was a musical instrument or not. And then there's also a burial underneath. But the big thing, when we put all of these carved marble pieces together, this is what it's very typical Eula Valley marble base. Again, if you have the time and the resources, this is what we're able to construct. It is not complete. This is only about 70% its real size, because my printer just is not large enough to print it in real size. But it should have had two handles on either side. Okay. it was just fascinating because I'm a geologist, so this is not ceramic, so I loved it, right? It's marble, it's rock. It's a single piece of rock carved out of that into these very intricate shapes. You've got faces forward, faces on the side, the swirls representing wind, maybe from caves, who knows. And then these were really important. These little figures here actually allow me to date it, and the style allows me to date it as well. And so here are some examples that are in museums. So it would have had these nice handles on either side, which we could not find. We re-sifted all of that dirt over the December, found a couple more small pieces, but weren't able to find these two handles, which would have been jaguars or something like that. This style of vase was carved between 750 and 850 AD. It doesn't make it usually up into the Peten until the latter half, so 800 to 850 AD is probably the soonest that one of these vases would have made it up to our site. Again, a tiny site, 5,000 to 10,000 people. There are only like 4 examples of other sites that have these. Makes you wonder. Okay? So after we finished removing the top burial, we have this slate here. That's the yellow, if you can see that. And then under that, here are the stones and some limited skeletal remains with some teeth out here under a stone over here. So there is 2 people in this grave, one on top of the slate, one underneath the slate. Again, I hope to get carbon dates on those very soon. The ceramics suggest late classic. And so that's what it looks like. Not great, but I just wanted to show you that it's difficult to dig these. They're not really well preserved. And if you look right here, you have underneath those other slate slabs, we had the remains of one other person. So a total of 7 burials in a 4-meter, 5-meter area at the center of the courtyard. Now we've done the center of both other courtyards and they have no burials at this time. So this was a very interesting, special place. It was all constructed at one time. Perhaps these are dedicatory burials of some sort. More on that later when I have to start publishing articles on it. And so we have some interesting trade going on. We have atlatls, which we know are Western. You find some shell atlatls or bone atlatl hooks, but the sample size isn't very large, so I encourage everyone to come up and look at these so that if you find something even remotely similar, you're able to, figure out, you don't have to spend the hours of research it took me to figure out what it was. And then, of course, the Eula Valley vase comes from northwestern Honduras. There's a very limited collection of these. Hopefully we'll be able to, they have isotope data, so if we're able to export a small piece and do a little bit of drilling into a non-critical area, we might be able to prove through the isotopes that it's from the same valley, not just the same style. But generally speaking, all the ones I've tested have only come from this area, and it's believed to be a luxury trade good. It only goes from elites to elites. And so with that, I'd like to acknowledge everyone that helped out and all of our funders. That's pretty much it. And Mike Frank was the person who put together the atlatl, so I would highly recommend him if you have any reconstructions that you want to do. And these will be staying with the Belize Institute. We're donating the atlatl and the finger loops to the Belize Institute.
Before I say thank you to the presentation, I say thank you to the contribution. Thank you. And, are there any questions?
I was intrigued by the bowl you said that had been broken in quarters and stacked.
Yes.
Any idea why?
I believe it's related to the cyst burial. Honestly, I don't know other than cache. We find all of those caches are stacked pottery caches. In this case, it may just be this was a single vessel that they decided to put in the bowl. All the other ones are multiple small pieces of other vessels. This is the only one that was complete whole. Yeah.
questions?
Regarding your burial,
Yeah.
the one that is with a whole piles of,
Yeah.
of
Yes.
stones,
Mhm.
consider it being a bundle, you know?
But that's, yes, absolutely possible, for sure. It's elevationally wise, it's very, we kept getting soil layers in between. So I'm not sure 100% on that, but I would love any follow-up on that.
In Naranjo Sal,
Mm-hmm.
there is a change, a trend of a change of the ways they lay the funeral,
Yeah.
the burials,
Yes.
and it is from going lengthwise
Yeah.
to bundles,
Bundles.
so that's, and it changes the time with those things.
Yeah, and this is definitely later than the other cis burial, so I will definitely look into that, and thank you very much. All right, thank you. Oh, sorry, one more person. Just trying to get off the stage.
Can you tell me what is the connection with Pacbitun and to the other Mayan sites in the country?
We believe, based on what we see in the Middle Preclassic, that we were probably an independent site. We've got some really large structures now that we've found, but I believe we provide resources in the Late Classic, and so I would guess that we, especially looking at the changes in the burials and things like that, that perhaps somebody else has been installed to look over the site for some other, like Shenantonich or Careful or something like that. I believe by the Late Classic, we are under somebody else that's controlling those resources through us. All right, thank you.
Thanks again for the update on the Pacbitun scenario.